We are continuing with the axial skeleton. Remember, it consists of the skull, the vertebrae, and your thoracic cage. So here we're going to look at the vertebrae, or the vertebral column, which consists of 24 individual vertebrae. So remember, you're boneless. Let's go ahead and look at the boneless really quickly to see what we're going to be viewing. So on your boneless, please find the vertebral column, and we're going to be looking at these terms right underneath it. So the 24 vertebrae can be organized into 3 main sections. First is the cervical section. So here you'll have 7 cervical vertebrae. Next is the thoracic section. So you'll have 12 thoracic vertebrae. And the last is the lumbar. You'll have 5 lumbar vertebrae. That's what these numbers are in parentheses, is how many vertebrae you have in each section. So I was once told that this is easy to remember because think about the time maybe a normal person might have meal, 7 for breakfast, 12 noon for lunch, and then 5 for dinner. And then note that they all add up to 24, 7 plus 12 plus 5. And then after the vertebrae, you have one bone called the sacrum. So that's down here. So taking a look at this picture, up here we have the first 7 vertebrae are cervical, the next 12 are thoracic, then the bottom 5 are lumbar, followed by 1 sacrum, and then you might notice right here it almost looks like a tiny tail. It actually is the remains of our tail. That is called the coccyx. All right, so now what we want to do is take one vertebrae, a typical vertebrae, and look for markings on the vertebrae. Markings are individual smaller features on the bone. So what we're going to do now is go through a typical vertebrae and locate all of the items on your list. So let's take a look at that list one more time. All right, so on your list, we're going to go through this section right here, which is identify on all vertebrae. So we're going to find all of these smaller markings or structures on a vertebrae. So the body, the spinous process, transverse process, vertebral foramen, lamina, pedicle, superior articular process, and inferior notch. All right, so let's start off with the vertebral body. So that is the main base of the vertebrae, the solid structure right here. Next is the spinous process. So the process is anything that projects outward. Now you can actually feel these spinous processes. If you run your hand down the back of your neck and basically down your spine, you'll notice these tiny little bumps. Those bumps that you feel are the spinous processes of each individual vertebrae. So like I said, a process is a projection. So the spinous process projects straight out the back. Now you have 2 transverse processes on either side. So one is here, and then the other one is out here. Remember, transverse means to go across. So you notice these transverse processes go across to either side. Now, if you are to pick up your vertebrae in between your spinous process and your transverse process, the part that you can touch right in the middle, here and here, is called the lamina. Next is the pedicle. So imagine now you're picking up your vertebrae and you're holding the one piece that's between your vertebral body and your transverse process. So that small section just right here is your pedicle. You might notice the large hole in the middle of your vertebrae. That hole is called the vertebral foramen. Remember, foramen means hole. Vertebral is because in here you'll have the spinal cord going straight through it. So you might remember that you have the vertebral cavity as part of your dorsal cavity. So in here is where the spinal cord will go through every single vertebrae. Now if you take a lateral view of a typical vertebrae, see it from the side, we'll find the other structures. So the superior articular process, so again, process is a projection. Superior means on top. So the superior articular process will project above the vertebrae, so up towards the top. So there's 2 of them, 1, 2. They almost look like little ears sticking up. Now, on the bottom of the vertebrae, you have something called the inferior notch. So of course, inferior means below. A notch is a small indentation. So right here, you can see you have the inferior notch. What's really interesting is that when you stack up all 24 vertebrae, the inferior notch is going to go right on top of the superior articular process of the vertebrae below. So it's like a puzzle piece and they'll stick together. All right, so now we've gone through all of the features on the typical vertebrae, and you should be able to locate them in lab. So I have a question for you. Think about the 3 sections of vertebrae. What vertebrae articulates, which means to come in contact with, the skull? Is it the cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, or lumbar vertebrae? Well, hopefully you thought of the cervical vertebrae. Remember, the cervical vertebrae are the one on top. They're the most superior of the vertebrae. So right on top of the cervical vertebrae, your skull is actually going to sit. And in fact, it's going to sit on that very first cervical vertebrae. So now I want to bring to your attention 2 very special cervical vertebrae. The reason why they're special is they're going to be important for holding up your skull. The first is called C1. When you see the 1 after, that means the number of vertebrae. So we count the vertebrae from top to bottom. So C is for cervical, and 1 is for the very first very first vertebrae. So you'll see it right here in red, C1. So C1 is also called the atlas. So you might think about what atlas means. Atlas is actually a map, or you can think of the world, and it actually was a Greek god. And it's interesting, the Greek god Atlas, his job was to hold up the whole world. So think of this bone, C1 vertebrae, as being the atlas, and it's not holding up the whole world per se, but it's holding up your whole skull. So the atlas' job is to actually hold and support the skull. So this is actually what the atlas looks like. So you're going to need to be familiar in actually identifying C1, the atlas. What's interesting about C1, the atlas, is because it has to hold the whole skull, it has these structures right here called superior articular facets. So again, superior on the top side, and articular because it's going to articulate or come in contact with the skull. So you have one superior articular facet here, another superior articular facet here, and the skull is going to rest right on top of it. Another thing you notice here is these little holes on the side. They're called transverse foramen. Foramen again means hole, and transverse means across, so on the side over here. So you'll only see the transverse foramen on cervical vertebrae. Now the second special cervical vertebrae is C2. So the second in line. So right there, the second one. C2 is called the axis. So axis is like a turning point. You have axes on your car, for instance, where the wheels turn. So the importance of the axis is that at the second cervical vertebrae, it has this process called the den. The den shoots straight up. And the way it works is that C1 sits right on top of C2. And this little den basically is the turning point for the atlas and the skull. So when you move your head left to right and say, side to side, it's because your atlas is turning with your axis around this pivotal point right here. Think of it as almost like a door hinge. So let's check back in with our bone list and the vertebral column. So we've covered the vertebrae and all of the structures in it, and now we specifically talked about the cervical vertebrae. The first one, C1, the atlas, the second one, C2, the axis with that den, and the transverse foramen, which are the hole. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to distinguish between cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. Here I'm going to give you hints on how to distinguish between these 3 types of vertebrae. So remember, the first 7 are cervical. Here's a typical cervical vertebrae. The key thing to locating a cervical vertebrae is you'll see the transverse foramen, so the 2 holes on either side. So in total, in a cervical vertebrae, you'll have 3 foramen. The vertebral one in the middle, and the 2 transverse ones on either side, here and here. You will only see the transverse foramen on cervical vertebrae. Next is the thoracic vertebrae. So notice only one hole, the vertebral foramen. The thoracic vertebrae, one of the distinguishing features is this really long spinous process here. So if you turn it to a lateral view, the spinous process will be long and pointy. Whereas notice in the cervical vertebrae, it's a little shorter and a little more flat. The lumbar vertebrae, the last 5 of your vertebrae, again, note only the one vertebral foramen. The lumbar vertebrae, if you look on a lateral view, its distinguishing features are a very large vertebral body. So it's the thickest of all your vertebrae. And the spinous process, notice, is really large, but it's straight across and it does not point down. So the lumbar vertebrae are going to be the largest. And think about why. Where are your lumbar vertebrae located? Well, they're the 5 on the bottom. So they basically have to support all the vertebrae and all of the weight above, which is why they have to be the largest and sturdiest. So with these hints, you should be able to distinguish the 7 cervical vertebrae, the 12 thoracic vertebrae from the 5 lumbar vertebrae if you were just given one random vertebrae. The last of the vertebral column is the sacrum and the coccyx. So the sacrum comes right inferior to your last lumbar vertebrae, and the coccyx is below that. And again, the coccyx is the remains of the tail. So in this large picture, this entire section right here is the sacrum, and then this right here is the coccyx. So with that, we completed the entire vertebral column.